Okay, the next stage after I have blocked things in, you can see that I have kind of a rough sketch of where my items are and figuring out my proportions. My next step is going to be to start to erase some of the areas. Now I don't get too carried away. I like to use the flat magic rub or Stadler eraser. In fact, sometimes cutting a straight edge on it is helpful. I'm going to look at basically creating just silhouettes to begin with. Now if you look at this, the apple is darker than the background, the bottle is darker than the background. So I'm going to do just a very light erasing of that background. Because I want the bottle to show up a little bit stronger than the background. So the background is going to be kind of rubbed out. I'm using the flat part of the eraser and I'm just dragging it very lightly. Now one of the things you might think of as wanting to do things quicker. The more you erase and the harder you push, the more your mistakes will show. So what I want to do is slowly work this out and go over the areas and lightly rub out the highlights or the lighter area of the background. And you can see that I'm creating kind of a silhouette of the apple against the background here. Now the other thing is I'm not going to finish this part of the background till I have everything else kind of at the equal stage. If you just do one area, it's possible that you might create too strong of a value. And so I want to be able to come back and slowly adjust things as I go. So you can see with the silhouette right there that the apple is definitely going to be darker than the background. I'm trying to work with a flat surface so I don't make textures or lines that really don't exist. From there I'll go to the other side, and in this case you'll see that the bowl is whiter than the background, yet the background is lighter than the bottle. So what I'm going to do is flip this over so I have a little bit easier edge to work with, and I'm going to drag my eraser across this in a manner that my background is going to go from a light to a dark. So it's going to be erased next to the bottle, and I'm going to let it fade away as it goes over toward the top of the bowl. Again, all I'm doing at this point is kind of creating silhouettes of the shapes. I'm really not going to get into a lot of detail of the bottle yet or the bowl. Once I get these things blocked in, I can then start to think about details and highlights. I want to try to create as much three-dimensional form as possible when you start shading, and at this stage it's probably good not to do too much. Now the bowl is going to be fairly bright white, so I could take off a fair amount of this background, but I'm going to leave that for a future stage. Now the background and this rectangular piece of board or bottle or box or whatever it is back there, you can see there's contrast there. That's a very dark item, so if you remember things we talked about earlier, if you want something to look really black, put it next to white. So I'm going to try to make this background a little bit whiter, and by comparison that dark shape looks even darker because I'm comparing it to an area that I've lightened up. So you can see that I've changed. I'm not doing all this in the middle. I created the contrast here where I need it. I create the contrast over here where I need it. The apple here does a kind of a double thing. There's parts of it over on this side that is darker than the table, and there's parts of it up here that is lighter than the bottle. So again, I'm going to play around with the idea of how much pressure do I put on my eraser as I go around. And so it's pushing down fairly hard at the top or going over the surface several times to lighten it up. And as I come down on this side, I'm going to put less pressure on it and maybe leave it just to color the paper at that stage. Come over on this side a little more. And you can see that the subtle values start to build up, and I can eventually get to pure white if I need that, but again, I want to slowly build up my drawing to where I will make things as needed very subtle shading. And you can see where you start to already pull out that three-dimensional quality of the apple and where the light's hitting and where it's not hitting. Take your time. If you can get this drawing done in an hour or 2 hours, I'm going to guess it's probably not going to be done as well as it could be done. If you take maybe 6 or 8 hours to do it, and work very carefully on your details, you'll start to see that there are things that really have almost a photographic quality for shading. Where the apple is darker down here, I'm going to now start doing a little bit of erasing on the background. So the apple doesn't get changed, the background gets changed. And again, I don't want to just make a wide line around there. I want to slowly blend this away so it gradually fades. It creates the contrast where it's needed. I leave my blacks as they are. And I slowly start to create the three-dimensional form that it needs. Okay, I'm going to move on to the bowl. The bowl is a little trickier, and you can see that it's divided up into light and dark patterns. Well, sometimes just the shape of your eraser might serve as the size that will work out. If that doesn't work, I have other erasers. I have a retractable or a click type eraser that if you have something like that, that can help you. Another thing that you might use is just a regular pencil eraser. The only thing with a regular pencil is that eraser sometimes is a little more abrasive than you want. So you have to be careful when you're using that. But, just kind of going, I'm going to try the width of this eraser. And you can see that it works quite well for creating the top of the rim. Again, like I said earlier, if my drawing isn't quite right and I need to fix it, one thing you can do is you can come back and add some more charcoal on this. And just by putting more dark charcoal on that, taking your tissue and sometimes just taking a tissue paper, you can rub that back out and come back in and fix it again. So it's in a way kind of forgiving that you don't have to settle for what your first attempt is. You can always come back and add a little bit more. As I said, this has a little more detail to it. I like to preserve the darks that are already there. And the bowl has a nice spherical look to it. The values change from light to dark going right to left and light to dark going from top to bottom. So as I'm doing that, I'm just going to make some preliminary details there without doing too much. I can always come back and do more. Now the foot of the bowl is obviously darker than the tabletop, so I can come in and probably put a little stronger pressure on that part of the foot. Probably the hardest part of working with the erasers is you don't always have a detailed point that you get to look at as you're drawing. So it takes a little bit of work to try to get your shapes just right. And again, if you take off too much, add some more charcoal to it and come back in and fix things up. We will eventually come back with a number 2B charcoal pencil for some of the real extreme darks, and we'll work with that at a later stage. I have my ball. So you can see I've lost some of my detail of the ball that I had drawn in there. I'm going to go back to the bind charcoal again. I'll draw that ball back in. And because the ball is dark, I'm going to erase the inside of the ball. And again, I pay attention to what's happening with the shadow inside the bowl as it goes from light to dark. Obviously, it's not as light as the rim of the bowl, so I got to be careful not to take off too much. Maybe at this stage I might want to emphasize the rim being a little bit lighter. Maybe not as white as it's going to be, but at least just to try to show where the inside of the bowl ends next to the rim. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea of how you're going to go about the process of blocking things in. You can start picking out details as far as where things are really lighter or darker. I mean, I have the tabletop behind the apple that's going to be a little bit lighter. I have the background behind the apple is lighter than the apple. It's also lighter than the tabletop. So might want to get a little more of an edge there. So I will come back to this and do a little more on my own, and we'll go with more detail.